So I'm going to do this without a microphone, and I think Dr. Chase will as well. But I just wanted to welcome you all. I'm Jade Dellinger. I'm the director of the Bob Rauschenberg Gallery and director of exhibitions and collections here at Florida Southwestern State College. I love that we have such a great turnout for this. We're thrilled to have you here and be able to present to you a pretty extraordinary exhibition tonight and related events. As you probably know, the show is titled The Guerrilla Girls, Rattling Cages Since 1985. It's a site-specific interactive installation, so we will prompt you about the interactivity when you arrive in the gallery. There's a limited edition poster, which I hope some of you were given as you made your way in. And there's also a billboard project. So around town, over the next couple of months, you'll see some Guerrilla Girls designed billboard, our projects, billboard projects. So that said, I'd also like to thank our sponsors for tonight, the Diamond District. Todd and Jason have been remarkable. The billboard project would not be possible without their support, so we thank them for that. I wanted to sort of start by saying this 2019, and some of you have followed for decades, probably before my arrival, is our 40th anniversary for the Bob Rauschenberg Gallery, 2019. The Humanities Hall was built in 1979, and we have a rather extraordinary history, but because it's our 40th anniversary and we were thinking about programming, I feel it was important to me that we be a little self-reflective, to thinking about both that history, what we've done right, what we've done wrong. We can always stand to improve, certainly when it comes to, our representation of diverse groups, gender equity, all of those kinds of issues. So I thought we should start this 40th anniversary and 15th since the renaming as the Bob Rauschenberg Gallery with an exhibition of the Guerrilla Girls. When I approached the Guerrilla Girls, I was thrilled that they were open to the idea, enthusiastic in fact, about doing a project here. On a personal note, when I was an art history student at the University of South Florida in the 1980s, the book, which to this day remains kind of a text for art historians at the beginning, is The History of Art by Jansen. Some of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with the Jansen book, right? So it has been translated into 15 languages. It has sold millions of copies, and it was first published in 1963. By the mid-1980s, and it's still widely used today, even now that book has less than 10% representation of women in the book. When I was a student in 1985, when the Guerrilla Girls began, that book had 0 women in it. 0, right? So it's an important show. The sad thing for me is that these issues continue to resonate, and I feel like it's important for us to be reflective and self-critical at the same time, to present the work that we can. With that, Dr. Wendy Chase is a professor of humanities and heads our Honors Scholar program here at Florida Southwestern State College. She received her master's in French literature, PhD in humanities from Florida State University with an emphasis on film studies and modernism. However, she is uniquely qualified to provide insight into the Guerrilla Girls and the context from which they emerged, as her recent scholarship is focused on contemporary practices in art activism. She is currently serving as guest editor of the Journal of Interdisciplinary Humanities for their fall issue, aptly titled Art, Activism, and Pursuit of a Better Life. Wendy has introduced countless FSW students to the work of the Guerrilla Girls as she teaches interdisciplinary courses in modern humanities, American cinema, and contemporary world cinema. You might also know her for her work with the Black Mariah Film Festival. We are, of course, very lucky to have her on our faculty and here tonight to discuss this truly important and sadly still necessary ongoing work of the Guerrilla Girls. Wendy Chase.
Wow, that was nice. Can you all hear me? I think my gorilla gene makes me a little loud. So I think we'll be okay, but tell me if you can. Well, thank you very much, Jade. That was sweet. I can't think of a more appropriate exhibition to mark a moment in time when we have some very serious cage rattlers who are infiltrating our Congress, making it the most diverse Congress in the history of the United States. So I do want to thank Jade for honoring Rauschenberg's legacy of using art to engender social change with this particular exhibit. Rauschenberg, as many of you know, raised over $5 million for the Abuse Counseling Treatment Center here in Fort Myers. And women need male allies because systems of power do not change unless those who hold most of it actively embrace the need to share. So I think this exhibit is a step in the right direction. So I'm sure most of you know that the Guerrilla Girls are a feminist art collective who refer to themselves as the conscience of the art world because for 33 years now they've been on a mission to expose, to question, and hopefully to disrupt art world practices that exclude women and artists of color from circles of power which determine whose artwork gets to be seen and therefore what conversations are generated about the world we share. So while they formally organized in 1985, it was the impetus for them to organize was a response to an exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City that was held in 1984, and it was a survey exhibit of international artists, and they said, we're going to show you the most important artists on the planet right now. And so they featured 169 artists, and every single one of them was white. They were all from either the United States or Europe, and only 13 of them were actually women. So obviously people did picket the exhibit, but no one seemed to care, not the people who continued to go see it, nor the people who were directing the museum. So that's what inspired a group of women from the art world in New York City to gather to try to figure out some, maybe again, some more disruptive or radical strategies they could use to raise consciousness about these obvious imbalances. So the first group of women, it was actually before they had even named themselves the Guerrilla Girls. Again, most of them were artists, and they were painters, they were sculptors, they were photographers, they were black, Latina, white, gay, transgendered, and it wasn't only artists. There were a couple of art critics, there were curators, there were also people who worked in other, other places within some of the most important museums in New York. So what they did first is they adopted this sort of journalistic aesthetic. They did their research. They found some very compelling and disturbing statistics. And they used this, we're going to put up a shocking headline and then equally shocking and disturbing statistics to reinforce what we're trying to say here. So I don't know how well you all are able to read this. Some of these will be in the gallery as well. But in this one in the upper left corner, they are calling out all these male artists, including Klaus Oldenburg, Keith Haring, all kinds of people, Julian Schnabel, and they're for being willing to continue to exhibit their work in shows where they know that women artists weren't being shown at all. All of these, I think you can see in are self-explanatory. So again, from the beginning, they weren't only critical of imbalances in terms of gender representation, but also in terms of race. So these are some of their earliest issues addressing that. And then this one, which I'm not sure, this one is in the gallery as well. So they were really hell-bent on calling out the pernicious role that billionaire art collectors started playing in reducing the value of art to just a vapid commodity. These collectors often purchased art not because they thought it had something meaningful and interesting to tell us about the human condition necessarily, but because it was trendy and because they thought it was going to yield them a profit. Unfortunately, the art market is one of the largest unregulated markets in the world, and it's difficult to place an objective value on art in the way that you can a cell phone or a car. So it's more easily manipulated by billionaires who have the ability to bid up a work of art by an artist that they've already invested in. And today, of course, that's particularly challenging when a Jeff Koons can go for auction for $58 million, right? So even the Metropolitan Museum of Art doesn't have that kind of money. to buy one work of art for that much money. So today, I think in the past, and I'm probably going to say this might be a little contentious, but there's always been political problems, of course, with who are the trustees for our museums and galleries and what is their real motivation for being there. But I do think that for a long time there were a lot of philanthropists who were there because they respected the curators and the directors and they wanted to support their particular vision. And of course, there are many trustees who are still like that today. But starting with the Robert Scull auction, where he auctioned off a whole lot of paintings without compensating the artists who had bought their work from for very, very little money, including Robert Rauschenberg, who is on video to this day confronting him about this. Today, unfortunately, I would say that a lot of these collectors, they know, who are also trustees on the boards of these museums, they know very well that the museum directors and the curators depend on them to lend them their collection so that they can afford to put on exhibits. And so we have the tail wagging the dog, right? So not only they know that if they can pressure them to put on a show with their collection, that also jacks up the price and the value of their work. So when this is happening, again, this makes these art collectors who, again, aren't necessarily selecting the work because of its intrinsic or humanitarian value necessarily, but to just drive up their own personal prices, and they become the tastemakers, right? They become the people who are determining what all of us see, regardless of their knowledge, their education, their expertise, or their motivation for showing you this work. And as this kind of business model has grown and thrived, the Guggenheim, of course, is now a brand, and the Louvre today is a brand. So, obviously, it didn't take long for the Guerrilla Girls to start getting a lot of media attention, and more and more people wanted to interview them. And so they had to come up with some way to in the very beginning, they really needed to protect their identities because of the roles they were playing in the art world. They knew that participating in this kind of institutional critique was not, in the 80s, this was not a good thing for them, right? So it jeopardized their ability to work. So at one of their meetings, the Guerrilla Girl who was taking notes, they were already calling themselves the Guerrilla Girls, and of course they wanted to reclaim the word girls, and instead of making it an infantilizing term, they wanted to empower it again. And then of course they were using the term guerrilla, right, to show that they were warriors, that they were freedom fighters for the art world. But one of the girls who was taking notes on their meeting misspelled guerrilla as the animal, its homonym, and they thought that was hilarious. And so they're like, right on, we're going to make these gorilla masks, and this is who we're going to be. And they also understood that they needed to be funny. That this was, they were going to be calling people out. They were trying to embarrass people to a certain degree and shame them, but they knew that a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down, and they needed to find a way to use humor. So this is probably one of their most iconic works in 1989, and this was a product of what they called the weenie count. When they went into the Met and they counted how many nude women were actually in the museum versus how many female artists were there, and so they've updated it. And Jade also has made sure that you're going to see the most recent rendition of this billboard, which actually relates to the music industry in the gallery as well. Okay, and so I think this is probably one of their most popular, and certainly this for a long time was my personal favorite work of theirs. I know the print is small, so I'm going to read just a few of them. The advantages of being a woman artist: working without the pressure of success, not having to be in shows with men, having an escape from the art world in your 4 freelance jobs, knowing your career might pick up after you're 80, not having to undergo the embarrassment of being called a genius. And what I want to do now, instead of just sort of following the evolution of their aesthetic and how they're going to branch out later, and I will return to that, what I want to do is swerve back to history, in art history, so that you have stronger sense, and I know I'm talking to an art, I actually like it darker, that makes me a little less afraid of you. So that you can understand like exactly why it was so important that they came on the scene in the 80s, and again, why, as Jade said, we really still need them today. So I want to start with Sophonisba Anguissola. And she was from northern Italy, and she was a noblewoman. So she was from a wealthy family. She was one of 6 girls. And Castiglione had already written the courtier. And so at this time, it was actually expected for noble families only to educate the women in their families, the girls as well as the boys. So not only was she educated in literature and knew how she was literate, but her father also paid for her to have private lessons in art for over 3 years, okay, by this guy, Bernardino Campi. But you still have to understand. So she was very talented. Vasari, who is considered the first art historian who wrote Lives of the Artists, he's the reason we know what we know about Michelangelo and Da Vinci and Raphael, right? And we kind of had, it's great that he's the first art historian, but he also did kind of set in motion this notion that art history progresses from male genius to male genius to male genius, right? He mentions 4 in his second edition. He mentions 4 female artists. Only one gets an actual biographical spot. But he does mention Sophonisba, and you can read that for yourself. But to, again, understand the importance of her level of achievement, you have to know that to become an active artist, an artist who could really make a living in the Renaissance, you had to apprentice with a well-established artist already. And then you were invited to join the guild, the Painters Guild. But of course, do you think women could join the Painters Guild in the Renaissance? Of course not. They could only join the Lace Makers Guild or the Silk Makers Guild, not the Painters Guild. And of course, that was the only way that you were able to actually sell your work. So Sophonisba, however, was, okay, one more thing before we get into this. The other thing, at the time, they ranked genres of painting. So history painting was considered the most important genre of painting at the time, because if you could imagine, like the Last Judgment or the Crucifixion of St. Peter, or what are some of the other, where's Deborah? Give me another one. St. Paul, the conversion of St. Paul, yeah, right? So if you could imagine these big stories from the Bible or from mythology, and then visualize them for people, then you were going to get the commission to paint the Sistine Chapel or to paint a major altarpiece, and your reputation, of course, is going to live on in history because it's this big public building. Okay, so they also thought that history painting, you had to have this massive imagination, Portraiture was second on the list because it was just mimetic, right? All you had to do was know how to make an accurate likeness of a person. And if you were the least bit skilled in art, if you'd been trained, then of course you should be able to do that. So Sophonisba, that was all she was allowed to do, was portraiture, right? Women, again, it was hands off for history painting, which means hands off for the big commissions that are going to last in these major buildings. But she was a really, really skilled portrait artist, and she was also super sassy. So her portraits, people started first, her family kind of gave them to people. Some of her self-portraits she gave as gifts, but people immediately recognized that, yeah, she's super talented. Because she was a noblewoman, it would have been almost an insult to pay her at the time, so they would give her all these gifts. But in any case, she became really celebrated as a portrait artist to the point where King Philip of Spain invited her to the court, and she became a court painter, but her pay was different from the way that usually worked, and it was kind of under the budget of the queen, like the queen's I don't know, cash account for having fun. So what she does here, so all of that, I know that's a long preamble, I apologize, but the reason I say she's sassy is because what she's doing here is what we call hierarchic scaling. This is not the traditional way in which you see this. But in the Middle Ages, for example, it was very common for them to just make whatever figure they wanted to be the most important one in the painting, the largest one of all. Whether the scale was or perspective was accurate didn't matter. It was a metaphor for how important they were. So look at what she's done. First of all, she's painting her teacher painting her, right? Not her painting him. She's the one who deserves to be memorialized here, right? And not only that, but she's bigger than he is. She's in the center of the canvas. And then this is the part that I always think is really hilarious. She paints him using this mouse stick, which is what amateurs use to steady their hand. And if you don't think that is sassy enough, Her father, they went to Rome, and again, he did run as a nobleman, he ran in those elite circles, and so she was introduced to Michelangelo, and he already knew a little bit about her reputation as a portraitist, and her father, after they met him, he was like, you know what, we should send him one of your drawings and just ask him to give you a critique, and so they did that, and what she drew, this is not the first one she sent him, and we don't have a record of that. What she sent him first was a drawing of a little girl who was laughing and kind of jumping back at a crayfish, a crab. And so she was laughing and like that. And he wrote a letter back and said, all right, well, it's true. You're very talented, really skilled, but your subject would have been so much better had you painted a boy crying rather than a girl laughing. So, of course, what he means by that is boys over girls and tragedy over comedy, right? And so what she did, here's the sassy part, she drew that back to him. So she draws a little boy, based on her little brother, crying, scared or just being bitten by the crayfish. And in this one, she's clearly not laughing necessarily, but it's certainly mirthful, right? So she's like, nope, I'm keeping my mirthful girl in the image, and she's going to be laughing at you, whiner boy. Right? So, not only that, but then this becomes the source material for Caravaggio's painting later. Boy, bitten by a lizard. Oh, man. Darn it. Uh-oh. I need my help. It went, whoops. Okay, here we go. Okay, that's all good. Okay. Here's what we're going to do now. Okay, so I know, again, a lot of you are already going to know where I'm going just from what you just saw. Up there. I have to read you a couple of quotes to comment. Okay, so I have 3 quotes here I want to read to you. And it's all throughout history, male art critics who are evaluating women's painting. So in 1845, Baudelaire, the poet, and he was an art critic as well, he singled out the work of Eugénie Gautier for praise, and he wrote, "This woman knows her old masters. There's a touch of Van Dyck about her. She paints like a man. Eugénie Gautier's painting has nothing to do with women's painting." And then, maybe about 25 years later, Théophile Thoré, another art critic in France, evaluated the work of Rosa Bonheur, who's one of the most successful and well-paid female artists in all of art history, and he said, "Mademoiselle Rosa almost paints like a man. What a pity that her strong brush is not held by the other precious ladies who paint like young ladies." Okay, and then in the 1940s, so it doesn't stop, and again, I'm only giving you 3, and I'm stopping at the 1940s, but we could find some from 3 weeks ago, I'm sure. Hans Hofmann is going to give the same left-handed compliment to Lee Krasner when he says, "This is so good you wouldn't know it was painted by a man." So again, I think the 21st century ears, and especially in the Time's Up movement, right, it's just that obvious male standard feels offensive, but also in the age where we know so much more about gender fluidity, it seems an odd, right, something that doesn't really sit well. But maybe there is something to it. So what I want to do is I'm going to show you 2 paintings. I'm going to click back and forth. You're going to talk to people around you. I know a lot of you already know the answer to this question, so please let those who don't lead this discussion. And again, there's no... Okay, so what it is it's 2 paintings painted in, pretty close to each other in history, and it's the exact same subject. So it's from the Apocrypha. It's the story of Judas slaying Holofernes. And Holofernes was a Syrian general, and he had surrounded a Jewish city, and they were about to just take him down. And he and his troops were known for using rape as a weapon of war. And Judith was a Jewish widow, and so she was like, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to sneak into his tent, I'm going to get him drunk, and I'm going to seduce him, and then I'm going to kill him. And she did. And so one of these paintings was painted by a man, and one of them was painted by a woman. So I'll click back and forth and give you guys a minute to sort it out among yourselves, and then we'll talk about it. You're going to tell me which one was painted by a man and which one was painted by a woman. quiet.
He shows the woman.
Yeah.
Two women that way. Well, that might be a woman. Well, I'm thinking a woman would not like the woman.
All right. So if you think this one was painted by a man, just say aye. Aye. If you think this one was painted by a man, say aye. Aye. Perfect. So how did you know?
Because that one he's painted really detailed and muscular looking, like it seems like they're putting a lot of emphasis on the fact that he was manly.
Awesome.
She's
up.
yeah,
Yeah.
I also want to say too, her face, she looks kind of concerned, like, oh, I don't know if I should be doing this. And that's not what yeah, die.
Yeah, like I'm casually cutting off his neck like this. What were you going to say? Yeah. Oh, Ruby. I'm sorry? Oh, you were going to say the same thing he said. Right. So, obviously, right, this is, Caravaggio couldn't even imagine that a woman could do that. Artemisia, on the other hand, to take it one step deeper, this is a self-portrait of her, and this is a self-portrait of a man named Agostino Tassi who raped her, and he was her art teacher. And the solution to being raped by a man back then was that he should marry you. And for a while she actually entertained that, but until her father found out that he was there because he had raped another woman and then married her, and she had kicked him out, and her new husband had paid him to leave, and he was actually still married. And or her new boyfriend or whatever had paid him to leave. So Artemisia Gentileschi is actually going to go down in history. She is the first woman who gets to join the Academy of Painting in Florence. This is during the Baroque period. She ends up having a really, really amazing career, largely because, and if you look through art history to try to figure out like who were the women, the female artists, especially prior to the early 20th century, who were able to become artists, almost every single one of them had a father, or usually the father, who was also an artist. And so they had access to some kind of training. But the saddest thing about her, well, other than this story, but you gotta love her, because this is like hashtag off with his head, she's messing around. And she felt totally, almost after her death, the vast majority of her work was attributed to her father. No surprise. So again, this is why the part of that advantage is, that's what it means. Until a Caravaggio scholar said, this is not Caravaggio. And so he recuperated her in the 20th century. Okay? So, and this is also in the gallery as well. So of course it's true, you're seeing less than half the picture without the vision of women artists and artists of color. Which brings me to Edmonia Wildfire Lewis. Okay, so she was born in upstate New York, and her mother was Native American. She was Chippewa, and her father was an African American, a freed slave of Haitian origin. And I'm sure most of you know that New York, of course, freed the slaves long before the rest of the country. I believe it was 1837, and her brother ended up getting involved in the gold rush, and he actually got very wealthy, and so he and a couple of abolitionists sponsored her. First he sent her to a private school in New York, then they sponsored her to go to Oberlin College, which was the first college in the country to accept black women, and black people and women. But unfortunately she had a terrible experience at Oberlin where two of her white roommates accused her of spiking their wine with Spanish fly. And they put her in jail, and she was actually dragged out of the cell and beaten and then found. And the man, whose name escapes me, but he founded Howard University. It was the first celebrated African-American attorney, represented her. And she, of course, got off. There was absolutely no evidence to support it, but she couldn't go back to Oberlin, so her brother then sponsored her going to Boston, where she won a commission. She started studying sculpture with a sculptor who was sculpting busts of abolitionists. And so she was like, I want to do that too. So she actually won a commission to sculpt a medallion medallion of a famous abolitionist, and they sold so many of them that it funded her to be able to go to Italy, where she lived for a long time, and sculpted in this neoclassical style. And the majority of work that she made was, they say you're only hearing half of the you're only hearing half the story. And you're only having certain conversations, right? Okay. So in the same way that there was a hierarchy of genres, there was actually also a hierarchy of materials. So oil painting on canvas, that was number one. And sculpture, of course, was right up there with it. But quilting, of course not, right? That was like, that's women's craft. That's not art at all. Harriet Powers was an African-American slave, and one of the ways women could buy their way out of slavery was by making quilts. And before emancipation, quilts served a very important function for the Underground Railroad, because people who would hang a quilt that had black squares on it on their door or on their porch, it was a signal to people that this was a place where you would be safe. And she was of West African descent, so the appliques you see here that were clearly inspired by West African art are what stunned people, because she ended up presenting this quilt at just a local fair in Athens, Georgia, I believe, and this white art teacher named Jenny Smith saw it and was blown away, and bought it for her for $5 and said, you can come see it whenever you want. And then what that teacher did is she submitted it in a state fair, not as if she had made it, giving Harriet Powers full credit for having made it. And these women from Atlanta University came and saw it, and they were like, who is this person? And she is amazing, and we're going to go commission more from her. And they did, but only two survived. The Bible quilt, which is in the Smithsonian, and another one that's in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. But to look at these, her use of West African patterns, again, in 1885, 1886, when Matisse and Picasso are going to start using West African motifs in their art in the beginning of the 20th century, people are going to be like, genius. They are geniuses. This is amazing, and they're so progressive. But does anyone care about Harriet Powers? No, right? So again, and if you go back to the Middle Ages, the Bayeux Tapestry, I didn't put an image of it up here, but what Jade was saying about art history textbooks reminded me of this. It's considered being one of the most important artifacts from the Middle Ages, works of art really, from the Middle Ages. No one knows who commissioned it, no one knows who designed it. The only thing they absolutely are certain of is that it was made by women, right, by nuns. They know that. But it's always like a footnote, like no, and the assumption is always that some man designed it. So again, uniquely really because of the materials. And I don't know how many of you saw this as well, but not long ago, did you see the article where they were renovating a church in Germany, and they excavated part of it, and they dug up the part of it. They had to dig up these bodies, and one was a body of a woman. And when they looked in her jaw, she had lapis lazuli in her teeth. And the only possible explanation, and this was from like the 11th century, 12th or 11th century, I can't remember exactly, but definitely like way back in the Middle Ages. The only explanation for that was that she had to be an illuminator, someone who made illuminated text. And because there was so much lapis present, that they thought that she had to have been licking her brush to get it that way. But what that also meant, because lapis was precious and expensive and it came from Afghanistan, is that she was really good at what she did. She was an elite illuminator. But of course back then, we didn't know the names of many of those illuminators because everything was doing their work for God. But in any case, we're finding out more and more. Oh, I didn't realize we're finding out more and more about, as people continue to do research to the past, we are recovering more and more information. And that jaw of that nun is actually very important because it's material evidence, not just something that we find from writings and stories that these women were active. Okay, so Claude Cahun, this is another example of an incredible artist who wasn't recuperated or rediscovered really until 1994 by a French art historian who found a book, a very thin little paper book that she'd written called Disavowals, and it was tucked into a museum catalog. And he was looking at her work and was blown away, and found out from that that she kept mentioning the Isle of Jersey, which is off the northern coast of France, so he ended up putting an ad in the newspaper, and he was, does anyone know anything about this person? And an antique dealer actually said, yes, I happen to have part of the estate of her long-term partner. And so what he ended up finding out in terms of her story is that she was actually very closely linked to the surrealists in France. She was very good friends with Andre Breton. She was actually in close contact with the literati, with Georges Bataille, with Henri Michaud, and she did this incredible photographic portraiture that isn't only feminist, it's definitely a precursor to queer theory and the idea of performing your identity. And you can see that by the quotes. And they don't know that much about her. A lot of her work, unfortunately, has been lost, and the reason it has is because she was also Jewish. And so during World War II, that was when she left. She was from Nantes, then moved to Paris, and then she did leave to go to the Isle of Jersey. And one of the coolest things, the reason I was like, I'm just going to show her because I think she's so great, and I'm not quite sure how I'm going to tie her into this, but one of the things she and her partner did, which is awesome culture jamming. I mean, again, totally guerrilla girlish, but even more daring. There were apparently on that isle, a lot of the German troops would stay there, and as they needed them, they'd send them to the mainland. And so there were all these soldiers just kind of casually walking around town everywhere, and so they hand wrote these notes in the voice or in the character of a German soldier who basically were saying things like, yeah, it's time that we rebel, this is bullshit, let's shoot our officers. So they were trying to, and they would write these notes and they'd keep them with them, and when they passed by soldiers, they'd slip them in the pockets of their coats. They'd put them in like bags that they knew they would get. And they were doing like lots and lots of this to try to think that, oh, well, maybe we'll, the power of suggestion. Who knows what will happen. Unfortunately, they did get caught. They were arrested. They were put in a concentration camp. And they survived. They both survived the war, but apparently she was completely traumatized by that experience and never quite the same. But once again, it's really important that we continue to try to, and that art historians and historians continue to, to get these stories out here so that we can hear more than half the story. And of course, there's no way, Dr. DeLuca is here. I have to give a nod to her favorite artist, Frida Kahlo. And so Frida, I'm sure almost all of you know her story, but in case you don't, she had contracted polio when she was a little girl. Her mother was an indigenous Mexican Indian. Her father was European, and he was a photographer. And so she had polio when she was a kid, but then when she was 16, she was riding on a trolley car, and she got in an accident, and she was impaled. So this piece of rebar not only fractured part of her spine, but also her tailbone, and it pierced her uterus. Really nasty story. So she ended up, and this is in like 1927, 1928, so she was completely bedridden, in a body cast. Her father, who again was a photographer, said, we got to give her something to do. He got her, so she started drawing, she started painting, and when she was about 21, she was already, well on her way to becoming an artist, and she met, of course, the very, very famous Mexican muralist, Diego Rivera. So, of course, she was definitely under the shadow of him. They had a really tumultuous relationship, lots of affairs on both sides. But Andre Breton, the leader of the French Surrealists, went to Mexico to see Diego, of course, and then he sees Frida's paintings, and he's like, wow, how is this little lady, how is this Mexican little lady being a surrealist without we Frenchmen to guide her, right? How could she do that? And he did end up, they brought her back to Paris, and she did have an exhibit. And if, again, you pick up a textbook today, they're always going to categorize her as a surrealist, and there's very good reason for that. But she constantly refused that categorization and said, I'm not a surrealist, I'm a realist, I'm painting from my life experience. And one of her other very important contributions, of course, is just to keep visualizing female pain and making it okay for us to exhibit that. Oh, yeah, so we're going to shift back to the Guerrilla Girls now, who are often accused of just being whiny. This is some of their, again, more recent work from this year. So again, I'm only showing you like 6 artists. There are dozens and dozens more from art history. And by 1984, you can imagine, not only had art historians been working since 1971 landmark essay written by Linda Notchland called "Why Are There No Great Women Painters?" And the answer to that was, that's the wrong question, right? Why don't we consider great women artists as great painters? And why have they been locked out of the institutions that allow them to be trained and to exhibit, et cetera, right? So that was written in 1971, and so a lot of art historians were already shaking the art historical tree, reclaiming these artists. So by 1984, not only were there dozens and dozens and dozens of women from the past whose art they could have shown, but there were many, many, many very active, interesting, accomplished, talented, young, new artists who could have been shown. And so, and from all walks of life, too. So don't let museums reduce art to the small number of artists who have won a popularity contest among big-time dealers, curators, and collectors. If museums don't show art as diverse as the cultures they claim to represent, tell them they're not showing the history of art. They're just preserving the history of wealth and power. I'm not sure you can say it any better than that. Okay, so but just so you know, and again, I'm not going to give you an exhaustive overview because you're going to see it all and you'll be able to understand it, but I do think it's important to understand that they definitely started branching out from the art world in 2002, making this poster, which they've updated, and it will be out this year before probably in the next 3 weeks or month. I think the Oscars are at the end of February. So again, using humor, the anatomically correct Oscar, so that it looks like an aging man instead of that buff guy. And of course, also addressing issues, political and social issues as well. And addressing inequality in hiring practices in colleges and universities, where more male art historians get the job. And I'm not sure that they could do better than this most recent work that they did. So 3 ways to write a museum wall label when an artist is a sexual predator. For museums who are afraid of alienating billionaire trustees and collectors who donated the artist's work. So they chose Chuck Close, who was definitely outed in the Me Too movement as a repeated sexual harasser of his models. And he painted the official portrait of Bill Clinton. So one sexual predator painting another. So it says here Chuck Close is one of, I can't actually read it from that screen. I gotta read it from over here. Oh no, this is gonna be hard. Uh-oh. I'll do my best. Okay, Chuck Close is one of the most important artists of his generation. Oh no.
Patterns of color.
Thank you. Okay, and then here's for museums conflicted about disclosing an artist's abuse next to his art. Like many artists, he has had some disgruntled employees. So they're getting there. So the first part. And then this is the one which I really wish I could read. Chuck Close has had a huge career with prices to match. He has been accused of sexually abusing models and students. He picked up
fancy art schools.
How fitting and ironic that he painted the official portrait of
The art world tolerates abuse because it believes art is above it all and rules don't apply to Jean's white male artists.
Right. So that is their most recent work.
Hello.
Hey!
Nice to see you. Sorry, I'm so happy to see you all out there, and I have to apologize because I'm sitting here in my gorilla cave, and I happen to have a little dog who happens to be barking at the moment.
So if any of you have questions for Frida, this is the time to ask them. You have to speak loudly. So we did test drive this yesterday, and using a microphone wasn't as effective as simply you all talking. Anybody have a question so far?
Well, Wendy, that means you were absolutely clear, and everybody understood everything. Maybe we'll have some complaints. That's a possibility too.
I have a question. Frida, what do you think of the Andy Warhol show at the Whitney right now?
I'm sorry,
What
what?
do you think of the
What do you think of the Warhol
at
show at the
Whitney?
Whitney right now?
I haven't seen it because I've really seen enough of Andy Warhol. And I'm from Pittsburgh. I've even been to his grave.
So funny.
Who is your favorite painter?
How's that?
Who is your favorite painter from over there?
I'm really one of many artists of a collective, and each of us has a personal favorite, but our group is not about promoting the work of any individual artist. We actually support all artists. We think that the world needs more artists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Talk to us a little bit about what it's like to work in a collective, to work collaboratively for over 30 years.
Oh my God. Well, imagine being married to 50 different people for 30 years, all at the same time. Anything that happens in a personal relationship has happened in our collective. But we really have believed in the group, and we believe in agreeing to disagree, and we agree on trying to build consensus among ourselves and trying to be as diverse as possible, and allowing people with privilege to sort of shut up and listen, and people without privilege to speak.
Yeah.
What is it like to represent, to be a Guerrilla Girl?
Okay, so
I'm sorry, I didn't really hear that.
Ruby, why don't you come over here and let her see you? Ruby, this is Ruby Swanson.
Yay.
How old is she? How old are you, Ruby? 9.
Oh, hi, Ruby.
She has a question for you.
You're up awfully late.
She's a partier. You should see her dance. Okay, this is the camera, Ruby, so she can, there you go, she can see you.
Hi, Ruby.
What is it like to represent and be a Guerrilla Girl for all of the artists?
Well, it's kind of wonderful and it's kind of hard. I'm really proud of the work that we've done, and I've been in the group since the very beginning. But every morning I wake up thinking about what we're going to do next, not what we've done in the past. And it's very exciting. And in a way, it's a dream come true in my life. It's nothing I planned for. It's just something that happened and we ran with it, and I haven't looked back. Thank you.
Have you ever been tempted to reveal your identity?
No. It's so much fun to have another ego, another alternative ego to jump into. Some days I'm myself, some days I'm Frida Kahlo, and I don't think it's really important who I am, and you might be disappointed to find out who I am, and maybe it would even diminish the reputation of the Guerrilla Girls if our identities were revealed. I think this delicious secret of who we are, who we might be, and the fact that we might be the person that you're going home with tonight is a great power, is a great strategy, and it's really an advantage for us.
Yeah.
Why did you choose Frida Kahlo? What inspired you to choose Frida Kahlo as your identity?
Back in the mid-'80s, when our group started, the very first English language biography of Frida Kahlo came out, written by Hayden Herrera. And I was really taken by her personality, and her work was not as well known then as it is now, and it was even lesser well known in the United States than in Mexico, where she had sort of been an icon for a long time. And I was so taken by her personality, and in a way I wanted to make people think about her and know who she was. So it was like, I didn't think about it for a second. I might have second thoughts now because I'm not a Latina, and I think that it's a more complicated thing now. But it's something I did 30 years ago, and I haven't had a second thought about it. And Frida Kahlo has become more and more iconic, and sometimes I just like to channel her energy and channel her outrageousness and try to remember who she was when I'm speaking truth to power.
What do you think, excuse me, what do you think of the current administration's denigrations of the arts, except maybe for television?
Well, I think they've denigrated everything, and I'm kind of happy that art is probably at the bottom of their list of things that are important. I'm just shocked at how racist and sexist and homophobic and anti-environmental and how corrupt the Trump administration is, and I see it as a goal that all fair-minded people should have, is to try to reverse that.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Hi, Frida. I'm just curious. We're in an audience full of some artists, young and old and developing, and there's some cage rattlers. Do you have any advice for them?
Just keep rattling the cages. What we found is if you think of a way to do something that's unforgettable, people won't forget it. And a lot of political art points at something and says this is bad, and that's sort of like preaching to the choir. We've always wanted to transform people. We've always wanted to confront someone who doesn't agree with us and present the situation in such a way that we have, sometimes when they laugh, you have a hook in their brain, and we try to transform people. So I would say if you want to rattle some cages, you should try to think like the people who are keeping you in a cage for 5 seconds and try to figure out a way to get in there and pervert it.
I like it.
You have been a Guerrilla Girl for 30 years. How has the Guerrilla Girls and the art world changed since you?
I'm so sorry, I didn't hear that.
You've been a Guerrilla Girl for 33 years, and she wants to know how has the role of your role, the art world, how has the art world changed?
And the role of the Guerrilla
And the role of the Guerrilla Girls in response to that.
Well, we're always evolving and thinking about things because the situation changes. You know, racism was different 50 years ago than it is today. Sexism was different 50 years ago than it is today. One thing for sure is that the conscience of the art world has changed. We have changed, well, not us, but the Guerrilla Girls, along with many, many other committed activists. No longer would anyone in power admit, at least openly, that you could write the history of art with only white male artists. There was a time when everyone thought, all the experts in the art world really thought that art history was a meritocracy. Well, I think we've proved that that's not true. So that's a huge, huge leap of knowledge. What hasn't changed is the institutional structure of the art world. Museums, galleries, even down to university art departments. It's still white male dominated. And the art market particularly. So that's what now we have to focus on changing. It's not a question about empowering ourselves. We're ready. We've got what it takes. Women, artists of color, trans, lesbians, bi artists. We have what it takes. It's the system that is excluding us and keeping us out. So now we have to really go after the institutional structure of the art world and change that.
I have a twofold question. Are all the Guerrilla Girls artists, visual, performing, written word?
Did you hear that?
No.
Okay, she wants to know if all of the Guerrilla Girls are artists.
Well, we're all involved in the art world in some way. I think the word artist is a little fluid. I think that you can be creative as a curator, you can be creative as a critic, you can be creative as, as a museum director. So all I can say is that all of the Guerrilla Girls are involved in some kind of creative work.
And the other part of my question, are there any male Guerrilla Girls?
Are there any male Guerrilla Girls?
Well, you know how hard it is to get guys to work for no credit and no money? So, of course, we have no dogmatic, idea about that. We haven't found the right guys, but we're always looking.
Yes.
What do you think about the segregation of women's art in a museum like the National Museum of Women's Art in Washington?
Well, that's a good and a tough question. The National Museum of Women in the Arts in Washington, D.C. Was a place that was founded when women artists weren't shown or collected anywhere else. So for that reason, it's needed. Now it does shows of a feminist nature, which is interesting too, because a lot of major museums won't touch that kind of subject matter. So my feeling is if they don't become ghettos, if they become a gateway to, to more mainstream institutions, that's great. I guess in short, I'm saying until we don't need them, we need them.
I have guys did a major exhibit in 2016. Why would you say that the Tate is willing to host you, but you haven't been hosted by the Museum of Modern Art yet? You haven't had an exhibit at any of our major art museums, but you did in England.
Well, I think the Brits and many other Europeans love to hear Americans criticize the U.S. But there's another reason, and that's that most European cultural institutions are state-run. They aren't as driven by money and by wealth and by philanthropy. They actually believe that when you have a problem, the government should solve it rather than finding a rich person to perhaps solve the problem. So I think they're finding that their museum institutions are beginning to adopt a kind of American policy of finding benefactors, and I think they're afraid of the Americanization of European museums. So I think they ask us to come in and maybe help shake them up a little bit and maybe keep them honest. But that's a really good question. I mean, we really attack the power structure of the American art world, and I think that makes a lot of American institutions very nervous because they're built on philanthropy, and we all know that philanthropy is great and wonderful, but sometimes it doesn't solve problems; it just keeps them going.
Oh, all the way in the back? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering, in changing the mindset of people, do you feel that you have better likelihood of changing things going through the male course for men to go to other men and say these changes need to be made, or pressure from women coming forward and saying we need these changes, so it's an equal path for all artists?
Did you hear that?
Well, yes, I think it's a really good military strategy to attack your enemy from all sides. And of course, I think the challenge now is to get more male feminists.
Yeah.
I think there were a lot of progressive men in the last election who were secret sexists, and they could not imagine voting for a woman, an outspoken woman, a powerful woman, a woman with a great deal of experience. I think that's the deep, dark secret of the Democratic Party.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you.
I know all of the work that's in the show, How do you like it? Oh, you haven't seen it yet?
No,
I'm sorry. Well, we're so excited because this was a digital show. We sent all the files to Jade and to the Rauschenberg Gallery and told them to install it however they want. And it's always thrilling to see how other minds are able to organize and present our work. So we're really thrilled that this can happen. And we like to think of all the places that take our show. It's called The Art of Behaving Badly. We're just thrilled that they become conspirators with us in presenting our work. So please visit our website. If you would like Guerrilla Girls souvenirs, it's sort of how we get by. We sell t-shirts and posters and tea towels and all kinds of stuff. Please go to our website, guerrillagirls.com. Also, we have a Facebook page where you can find out where we are and what we're doing. And I don't know, is there a march on Saturday anywhere in South Florida?
Yes.
Great, well, we'll see you in the street.
Sunday in the Centennial Park?
Sunday, Centennial Park, 11 until 2.
Okay, got it.
Great.
Go Frida.
Thank you, Frida.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think we can go enjoy the show. Thank you so much.
Sure, thank you.